All righty, everyone, welcome. So we're gonna get going. Welcome to our Fill Your Pantry Processing Tomatoes webinar by University of Illinois Extension. Since it is 1 o'clock, we're gonna go ahead and roll out here. Before we start, we do ask to make sure that your microphone is muted to prevent any type of background sounds and to make sure your camera is turned off. And that helps increase our bandwidth. So we have a really strong bandwidth throughout today for the presentation. So today is our last of our 8 webinars in the Fill Your Pantry series, following the previous canning, freezing, fermenting, drying, pickling, and our specialty webinars that were on jams and jellies and preserving apples. So all of our webinars are being recorded, and all of our previous webinar recordings are available on our website. And I'll put it in the chat box as well, but that link is go.illinois.edu/nutritionwell. Please, we do encourage you to use that chat box today to ask questions. We will keep track of those questions, and Jenna will be answering the questions at the end of the presentation. Another thing to keep in mind is that Jenna will be talking about some troubleshooting with tomatoes near the end of her presentation, so you may want to hold out on your questions. We also ask that you do please refrain from answering questions in that chat box. Please leave it to Jenna so we can provide you with the most up-to-date research-based information. We really appreciate it. Since we are limited to an hour, and if we don't address every single question in there, we will be sending you all the questions and answers from the chat box in a really nice handout, along with some other helpful handouts from today. And you'll receive them the next 10 to 15 days or so, which will give you instructions after you filled out the survey for us. The recording for this one will be available tomorrow on our state page. Alrighty, so my name is Lisa Peterson, and I will be your moderator today. I'm a nutrition and wellness educator with University of Illinois Extension. I work in Christian, Jersey, Macoupin, and Montgomery counties in West Central Illinois. And your presenter today is Jenna Smith. She's also a nutrition and wellness educator, and she serves in Livingston, McLean, and Woodford counties in Central Illinois. So Jenna, I'm gonna pass it on over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lisa. I'm certainly excited to present this topic today. I know for my family, tomatoes are just the prized possession of our garden. It's kind of the one thing that we plant year after year, no questions asked. And I just really love the versatility that tomatoes offer, especially when it comes to preserving them. So today we're going to discuss the methods to canning, freezing, and dehydrating tomatoes. And throughout this lesson, we will identify some food safety concerns that you may need to be aware of. And we're going to answer those questions, some of the more common questions, but we'll try to leave some time at the end to get to your questions as well. So once tomatoes are harvested, if they're not already ripened, you'll want to store them at room temperature until they're fully ripened. And once ripened, you don't want to wait too long to use them, or they will begin to deteriorate if they're not used within a few days. And food spoilage is caused by a couple different things. First we have enzymes and chemical changes. And enzymes are natural chemicals. They're present in all of our food. And once activated, such as after the food is harvested, the enzymes speed up the process of decay by breaking down the tissues and the components of the food. And they speed up these chemical changes that result in the loss of flavor, the loss of color, and texture. And then we also have microorganisms like yeast and mold and bacteria that can begin to grow, and it could cause some food safety concerns. And they are very capable of multiplying rapidly under the correct moisture and the right type of food, the temperature, and different pH conditions. So in order to prevent food spoilage, there are 3 methods then of preserving. We have canning, freezing, and dehydrating or drying. And so you'll want to decide, what method you will choose to preserve your tomatoes. And, that likely is going to depend on the product that you're wanting to preserve, as, some things may be better suited for canning, while, others may be better suited for freezing or for drying. And canning is, probably the most complex, possibly the most time-consuming, but it can really produce some of those fabulous results. When you're canning, what you're doing is you're heating the foods to temperatures that inactivate enzymes. So the food doesn't decompose and you're killing the microorganisms that could cause foodborne illness. Now, for freezing and drying, you're not actually inactivating enzymes, but they do slow down the enzyme activity. And freezing and drying also is not killing microorganisms, but it does prevent microorganisms from growing by way of either reducing the temperature of food, such as in freezing, or by removing the moisture from the food, which of course would be drying. So many of you, like myself, probably have tomatoes growing in your garden or your container gardens. If you don't, you may be getting your tomatoes maybe from a neighbor or from farmer's market. But when you choose your tomatoes, you want to make sure that you're selecting only firm, ripe, or slightly underripe, disease-free tomatoes. You don't want overripe tomatoes, particularly when canning, as these will be low in acid. You do need to add acid to them, but even if you have overripe tomatoes, if you're adding acid like lemon juice or citric acid, this is still not going to acidify the overripe tomatoes enough to be safely canned. Now, green tomatoes or your underripe tomatoes are more acidic than your ripened tomatoes. And so if you are canning them, you're going to follow the same directions as what you would for ripe tomatoes. Dead or frost-killed vines, they may have too little acid, which is not sufficiently corrected by adding lemon juice, citric acid, or vinegar. So these should not be canned, but rather frozen or dried. And we'll get to the whole method of adding acid here in a few more slides. So before you start preserving your tomatoes, you need to first kind of consider your personal hygiene and the cleanliness of your kitchen. So making sure that you always wash your hands with soap and warm water for at least 20 seconds before you start, as well as when you change any type of tasks. Avoid handling food if you're sick, particularly if you have fever, diarrhea, nausea, or vomiting. And for those of you who might have long hair, just make sure to tie it back. Wash and sanitize your work surfaces with disinfecting spray or wipes, and you can make your own bleach water solution. You would just simply mix about 1 teaspoon of bleach per 1 quart of water. And make sure, of course, that all equipment and utensils are clean. So most recipes, whether they're canned, frozen, or dried, are going to call for peeled tomatoes. And when canning tomatoes, if the recipe calls for them to be peeled, then you must peel them, as the processing time is going to be based on a peeled tomato. So peeling is not too difficult. The first step is to, of course, wash your tomatoes first, and you do this just under cool running water. You don't want to dunk the tomatoes in a sink that's filled with water, just because if that water was contaminated, it can easily be absorbed through that tomato's stem scar. So after you've washed them, you simply then will dip them into boiling water for 30 to 60 seconds. And a little trick here is trying to score the tomatoes, or kind of taking a paring knife and slitting an X on the bottom of the tomato, and that can really kind of help to start that peel come off. You don't want to leave the tomatoes in that boiling water though for very long, because they will become mushy. So once you've kind of boiled them 30 to 60 seconds, take a nice slotted spoon, dip that into and get those tomatoes out of there, put them in a bowl of ice water, and then those skins should really slip off nice and easily. And so from here, you'll remove the core if you haven't already removed that core, and then you're ready to leave them either whole, you can have them, chop them, or whatever your recipe calls for. Okay, so we're going to start off by talking about canning first. So there's only 2 safe methods of canning. So it's not safe to can by way of a pressure cooker, microwave, oven, slow cooker, dishwasher, the sun, or basically any other kind of creative way that you can think of. So you have to can by either a boiling water bath canner or by a pressure canner. And so I'll kind of explain the differences here. The boiling water bath canning is going to heat foods to a boiling water temperature. So that's 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. And that's going to destroy most of your pathogens. So it's going to be used for your acid foods. So fruits, including jams and jellies, And any kind of pickled or fermented foods can be safely processed in a boiling water bath canner. Now your tomatoes and figs as well, they're on kind of this borderline of being a low acid food and an acid food. So their pH level is at 4.6, and therefore they have to have an acid added to them to ensure that they are safe. And again, we'll talk more about this here later in the presentation. Now for pressure canning, here we're heating foods past the boiling point. So we're heating them to at least 240 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is going to destroy all pathogens. And that includes the one that survives boiling water temperatures, Clostridium botulinum. And that's a potentially deadly bacterium. So for pressure canners, you're going to have either a dial gauge or a weighted gauge canner, and it's the only safe way to can any type of low acid foods like your meats, poultry, fish, seafood, vegetables, broth, dried beans, and some of your mixed foods, which are going to be those foods that are acidic mixed with foods that are low in acid. So you can see with tomatoes, you can can them either way. You can can them using a boiling water bath canner, or you can can them using a pressure canner. But it's important to note, if the recipe only gives one processing method, then that is the method that you should use. Okay, so Clostridium botulinum, it's a bacteria that's normally found in soil, and it's not harmful until it's placed in a no oxygen environment where it goes on and it produces this toxin. The canning forces oxygen out of jars, but if it's not heated to a high enough temperature to kill the Clostridium, the bacteria then can start to grow. And if the toxin is consumed, it causes a rare but a potentially deadly foodborne illness, which is called botulism. And so this is why you must can those low acid foods in a pressure canner. So if you have a pressure canner at home, and if you have a dial gauge pressure canner, just note that those dial gauges, they can become inaccurate over time. And even if you have a brand new dial gauge canner, you just took it out of the box, we do recommend that you bring in those canner lids to our offices every year to get that tested. It is a free service that we offer, and if you live outside of Illinois, check with your local extension office to see if they can check that gauge for you. Okay, so there are a number of ways to can your tomatoes, including transforming them into different tomato products, such as tomato juice or sauce or tomato paste. And you can also add ingredients to create other foods like salsa or spaghetti sauce, ketchup, and barbecue sauce as well. And I won't have time today to go through every detailed step to canning, but I do encourage you to watch our previous webinar from the Fill Your Pantry webinar series on home canning. And that's, of course, located on the University of Illinois Extension Nutrition and Wellness section of our website or our YouTube channel. And I believe Lisa there put that in the chat box. So to get started, you're going to need to first find a tested recipe. And we do recommend the National Center for Home Food Preservation and their So Easy to Preserve book or website, as well as the USDA Home Canning Guide for a variety of tested recipes for your tomatoes and your tomato products, as well as many other different types of products too. And it's just very important to only use up-to-date tested recipes, because again, you're working with tomatoes which fall on that borderline of being low acid, causing more risk for possible botulism. So do not use recipes from old cookbooks or church cookbooks or recipes that you may have found on the internet that have not been lab tested. Many old recipes call for what's called an open kettle method, and that's where hot foods, they're simply placed in the jars, the lids are added, their screw bands are tightened, but then no actual processing is done. And so if you're not using a boiling water bath canner or a pressure canner, then it's not going to be safe. So processing in the canner, that's what allows for that proper time and temperature to sufficiently kill the microorganisms, so you can't skip that processing step. So if you're just canning tomatoes and not like salsa or some type of sauce, you have 3 different ways that you can can them. So for all of these, you first will need to add acid to the jars, which I'm going to cover on the next slide. But the first method there is packed in water, and you can use either a raw pack or a hot pack. So a raw pack would be if you're placing like whole or halved tomatoes that you've already skinned. You're going to pack them tightly in those jars that you've added the acid to. And then you're going to pour boiling water over those tomatoes. And then you're ready to process them. You can process them in a boiling water bath. If you're doing pints, that's 40 minutes. If you're doing quarts, you're going to process them for 45 minutes. Or you can process them in a pressure canner for 10 minutes at 11 pounds of pressure. And that's for those here in Illinois or who have an altitude of less than 1,000 feet. Now, a hot pack is going to be a little different, where you're going to actually take your whole or halved tomatoes, you're going to put them in a saucepan and you'll cover them with water. You're going to boil them gently for about 5 minutes. And then you're going to take a slotted spoon, you're going to get those tomatoes out of there, you're going to pack them into the jars, and you're going to pour that liquid then right over those tomatoes. I will say the hot pack generally does yield a better product because those tomatoes are going to be less likely to kind of float to the top. Because when you're using a hot pack, you know, by kind of gently boiling those tomatoes are shrinking a little bit. So you're able to kind of pack them in more tightly when you do the hot pack. And you're going to process those for the same time as you would the raw pack. Okay, so the next method is the no added liquid. And here you're going to place whole or halved tomatoes in jars, and then you're going to press down using like a wooden pestle until the spaces between them fill up with juice. And the processing times may be doubled than those that are packed in water. So if you're processing in a boiling water bath, it's going to take 85 minutes, and that's for both pints or quarts. If you're processing them in a pressure canner at 11 pounds of pressure, it would be 25 minutes. And then the third option there is packed in tomato juice. So there you have a raw pack where you're going to heat up tomato juice in the saucepan, but then you're going to just pack those raw tomatoes in those jars, and you're going to pour that hot tomato juice then over those tomatoes. And then you have your hot pack where you're placing your tomatoes in the saucepan. You're going to cover those tomatoes with tomato juice, and then you're going to boil gently for 5 minutes, pack the tomatoes, put the juice over that into those jars, and then you're going to process those as the same times as you would for the no added liquid. So those are your methods then for really kind of just, you know, processing or making just basic tomatoes. And so as we said, you know, with the many different varieties of tomatoes, we just can't be certain of their acidity level. And so you have to add acid to them prior to canning. And so this is kind of the directions here of what you would need to do. If you are working with pint jars, you're going to choose one of the options. You're going to either use bottled lemon juice or citric acid. Now you can use vinegar, but I'll just note that vinegar will have kind of this undesirable flavor. I mean, I think we all know the flavor of vinegar. And as you note here, you know, you need 2 tablespoons of vinegar per pint, all the way up to 4 tablespoons of vinegar per quart. And so it can kind of give quite a bit of flavor that you may not necessarily want. And so if you are going to use lemon juice, do make sure that it's bottled lemon juice and that it's not fresh. The acidity level will vary among your different lemons. And so again, 1 tablespoon of bottled lemon juice per pint, that would be 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice per quart. Now, citric acid, it can usually be found in the powdered form, usually next to all the canning supplies. The nice thing about citric acid is that it usually doesn't contribute to much flavor. So you would use about 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid per pint, or about 1/2 teaspoon then per quart. So just remember to add the acid directly to each jar before you add your tomatoes, and that way you won't forget them. Okay, so my colleague here, Mary Liz Wright, is going to show you how to can tomatoes, and she's going to use the no added liquid method. So I'm going to play this here, and you can sit back and watch.
Today we're going to can tomatoes. The first step is to slip the skins off of the tomatoes, and to make that process easier, I am cutting an X in the blossom end of the tomato. Then place the tomatoes into the boiling water and watch for signs that the skin is beginning to loosen, anywhere from 30 seconds to around a minute. And the next step is to plunge it immediately into ice water. You'll see how easily the skin slips off the tomato. Once you've done that, you're ready to chop them for salsa, can them whole, halved, or quarters, or squeeze them into tomato juice. Only high acid foods can be processed in a hot water bath. So we need 2 tablespoons of commercial lemon juice for each quart. At this point you could add salt, and every layer or so we're going to push them down with a wooden mallet. We want to take a plastic knife around your jar because we want to make sure that there are no air bubbles in between our tomato halves. We want a 1/2 inch of headspace. I want to clean the top of my jar, making sure there's nothing between the glass rim and the gum sealing compound on the lid. Twist the ring in place just until it is finger tight. We're going to place it in our hot water bath canner. Keep a pan of boiling water on hand. Pour it to the side. The jar should be covered by 1 to 2 inches of boiling water. Cover it with a lid. Turn your stove to high. And in our case, we have a quart of halved tomatoes. The processing time will be 85 minutes. If you had used smaller bits of tomatoes or tomato juice, your processing time would be less. Tomatoes are the most popular thing to can. However, make sure that you're using a recipe that has been tested.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about just tomato juice. If you do can tomato juice, you should be using pint jars or quart jars, not half-gallon jars. Half-gallon jars should only be used when you're canning very acidic juices, which really would only be about grape or apple juice. And just like when you're canning tomatoes, you're also going to need to add acid using the same instructions as we said before. Okay, salsa. Who doesn't love salsa? You know, most salsa recipes are mixtures of low acid foods like onions and peppers along with acid foods. And so while you may have a really delicious salsa recipe, you cannot can it unless it has been tested for safety in a commercial laboratory. So unfortunately, there is no equation that you can put your homemade salsa recipe in to ensure that you have a safe product. You have to either, freeze it, or you can just refrigerate it and eat it within a few days. And the same goes for other tomato products, such as homemade pasta sauce or homemade barbecue sauce. You may, again, have a really great recipe for these, but it doesn't mean that you should can it. When you start adding other ingredients that, you just can't be sure of the acidity level of the product. So you need to just refrigerate it or freeze it. So when using a tested salsa recipe, there are a few things, though, that you can do to kind of make it your own, so to speak. But there's also a few things that you cannot do. And so we'll kind of go over this here now. You can change the type of onion or pepper. So for example, if the recipe calls for like a white onion, it's okay to go ahead and use a red onion instead. Or if it calls for maybe a jalapeno pepper, but say you don't really want to have that heat, you can go ahead and you can use a green bell pepper instead. But you cannot increase the total amount of onions and peppers in a recipe. So, if the recipe calls for, let's say, 6 jalapeno peppers, you cannot substitute 6 bell peppers instead, because when you think about bell peppers, these are a lot larger. But if the recipe called for 4 cups chopped jalapenos, then it would be fine to use 4 cups chopped green bell pepper instead. So spices and herbs, you can completely alter those. You can leave them out if you want to. Those are completely fine to do that. If you want maybe fresh cilantro, it's going to be better, though, to add that one after you've opened the jar and just before serving. but you cannot decrease the amount of vinegar or your lemon or lime juice. If it tastes just too kind of vinegary for you, you can add sugar, or you can substitute bottled lemon juice for the vinegar, but you can't do the other way around. You can't substitute vinegar for bottled lemon juice. So just know that it can result in a less acid and potentially unsafe salsa. Remember, you can only use bottled lemon juice, not fresh. So bottled has a standardized, acidity level, whereas your fresh lemons or your fresh limes can differ in the amounts of acid. And if you are going to be using vinegar, do make sure that the vinegar says it is at a 5% acidity level. Now you can thicken salsas with flour, cornstarch, or other starches, but only after opening. You cannot thicken it with these types of things before it's canned. Your thickening sauces with starches can alter the acidity level, and it's just unsafe to do so. So if you want a thicker salsa, first of all, make sure you're kind of using one of those tomatoes, a paste type tomato, that will help. But also just pour off some of that liquid after you've opened it, or you can add these thickening ingredients after you've opened them. And another thing too, just to remember, is you don't want to drain or squeeze your tomatoes to remove liquid and juices before you can them, because that will remove then some of the needed acids. Okay, so if you don't have an abundance of ripe tomatoes ready to can, or maybe you just don't have the equipment or feel comfortable canning, you can definitely try freezing them. Freezing tomatoes is really a safe and easy preserving method. And other than a freezer, there's no expensive equipment that you need. And while the tomatoes, they will become a little watery, of course, whenever they're thawed, they can easily be thrown into soup or made into sauce. I know for myself, I like to use my frozen or even my canned tomatoes to make spaghetti or pizza sauce. And what I do is I just take my frozen, tomatoes or my canned tomatoes, and I simply add a can of tomato paste to them. And then I'll add some fresh garlic, other seasonings like, dried basil or oregano. I'll let that simmer. You don't even have to add salt if you don't want to. And it's been, years probably since we've bought a jar of spaghetti sauce. So it's really wonderful. So unlike most vegetables, tomatoes don't have to be blanched. And while you don't have to take the skins off when you're freezing, many people will tend to prefer them without the skins. So you can take the skins off in the same manner that we stated earlier, by dipping them in that boiling water for 30 to 60 seconds. And then you're just going to core those tomatoes, and you can leave them either whole, or you can, chop them into pieces or quarters, however you want to do it. And then you can pack them just directly into your freezer containers or freezer safe plastic bags, and you'll leave about 1 inch head space, meaning that space between the tops of the tomatoes itself and the top of that container lid or space, and you'll just seal it and freeze it. So it's really quite simple. Now, if you do prefer to leave those skins on, you could just simply wash the tomatoes, take out the core, and you could put the tomatoes directly on a cookie sheet, freeze them until they're nice and solid, and then once frozen, you can pack them into freezer safe containers or bags. And in addition, you can freeze stewed tomatoes or tomato juice. You'll see there for stewed tomatoes, you just peel them, you'll cut them into quarters, and then you'll cover and simmer them for about 10 to 20 minutes, and then drain, let them kind of cool off a little bit, and then put them into those freezer containers and freeze. And for juice, you don't even really have to peel those, because you're going to cut them in quarters, you'll simmer them for 5 to 10 minutes, and then you can just press them through a sieve. If you want to salt, you can do that as well, but you don't have to. And with the tomato juice or any kind of tomatoes that you might be freezing, you can also use canning jars to store them in. And the canning jars are durable enough to be used as freezer containers, but we recommend using the wide mouth canning jars that specifically say on the packaging that they are freezer safe. And if you are going to be freezing tomato juice, you'll want to leave about 1.5 inches of headspace because of course that will expand quite a bit. So there are two types of green tomatoes, those that are green when they are fully ripe, and those are generally your heirloom varieties. And then of course you just have your green unripe tomatoes, and both of these can be frozen, and you can even later fry them for fried green tomatoes. So you have the directions here, washing and coring them, slicing them 1/4 of an inch thick. You can pack those slices into freezer containers or freezer safe plastic bags with like this freezer paper in between for frying, and then leave about 1/2 inch headspace, seal and freeze. So pretty simple. And I know that for cherry or grape tomatoes, you can also freeze those as well. So cherry and grape tomatoes are ones that are not really suitable for canning. And they're not suitable for canning because your cherry or grape tomatoes, you have to leave the skins on. And when we are canning our tomatoes, you know, when you're canning, you need to take the skins off of them because the processing time is based off of a skinned tomato, a peeled tomato. Those cherry grape tomatoes, they're just, it's not that you can't take the skins off of them, but it's just not very practical. It's going to take some time. And so the best option for really your cherry or your grape tomatoes is to not can them, but rather freeze them. And for us, I know here at my house, well, of course, my son, he eats cherry tomatoes like they're candy. But what we like to do is we like to roast them. I put them, you know, I get a little bit of olive oil and I put them in the oven at 450 for 20 to 25 minutes until they've blistered and kind of split. And then just pack them into freezer bags and freeze them. And they're really, really good, especially if you've got some pasta, maybe some pesto, you can mix all that in. It's really, really quite delicious. So drying is another option to preserving your tomatoes. And the best tomatoes to use for drying are going to be, you know, a Roma or any other type of paste or meaty tomato. You can use grape or cherry tomatoes to dehydrate as well, but the slicing tomatoes, you can do it, but they just tend to not hold together quite as well. The flavor of the tomato, though, I love it when it just becomes more concentrated. And so you get a really good just tomato flavor whenever you dry your tomatoes. You can rehydrate them in water, but it's not really necessary. You know, I like to just add dried tomatoes directly to soups, stews, or sauces. And you can use even dried tomatoes in a savory trail mix or add them to pasta dishes or maybe some of your other favorite recipes. I actually recently just took dried tomatoes and I put them in my food processor with almonds, olive oil, Parmesan cheese, and a few little spices. And I made kind of like this sort of pesto, and I spread it on top of pork chops, and then I fried them in the air fryer, and they were really delicious. So there's a lot of things you can do still with your dried tomatoes. And there's basically 2 recommended methods to drying your tomatoes. Outdoor drying is not recommended for vegetables and for meats, and this includes tomatoes. Drying in a microwave is also not recommended for tomatoes or anything really other than herbs. And then indoor air drying is not recommended for anything other than herbs and hot peppers. So that really leaves us with 2 options. And the best option here is the electric dehydrator. Now, an electric dehydrator includes a fan to circulate your air, and then also has a heating element to heat up the air to a temperature of 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And there are 2 styles of dehydrators. The picture there, which is up top, is your vertical style. And then what's on the bottom is your horizontal style. Now, the vertical styles, they tend to be round with stackable trays, and the heating element in the fan is located at the base or the bottom. And the horizontal style, they tend to be more of the boxes with trays that are going to slide in and out. And their heating element in their fan is on the side. And the major advantage of the horizontal box dehydrators is that several different types of foods can be dried at one time, because it reduces this odor flavor mixture. So you can dehydrate your tomatoes, for example, along with your apples, and your apples shouldn't taste like tomatoes. Also, the horizontal style, it heats more evenly, while the vertical style requires you to rotate the trays every once in a while, as the bottom tray is going to just dry a lot faster than the tray is at the top, which is, you know, farther away from that heating element. So the second option is to use an oven, but that's only if your oven is able to reach a low temperature of 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And keep in mind that, you know, oven drying takes 2 to 3 times longer than a dehydrator. So it's not very energy efficient. It can take almost, you know, 2 days to thoroughly dry tomatoes in an oven. And if the oven will reach this low temperature, you know, you can prop the oven door open about 2 to 4 inches, and then place a fan near the outside of the oven door, and that's what's going to help kind of improve that air circulation. Now, if you have a convection oven with a fan automatically in there, that helps, of course, too. So when you're drying tomatoes, it's not required to take off the skins, but again, you know, most people are going to prefer to do that, especially on those paste or meaty tomatoes, not necessarily your cherry or grape tomatoes. But you can take the skins off in the same manner that we kind of stated earlier, by dipping them in that boiling water for about 30 seconds. And then you'll slice them, you know, 1/4 to a 1/2 inch, maybe thick slices, or you can just halve and quarter them as well too. Of course, you know, as you have you know, the thicker the produce is, the longer it's going to take to dry. But you'll place them on trays, leaving about a 1/2 inch space between the tomatoes, and then dry those in your dehydrator at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. It can take anywhere from 10 to 18 hours, just kind of, again, depending on many different things. But you want to try to kind of turn the tomatoes if you need to, rotate those racks as well if you need to. So another fun option is to make a tomato leather, much like a fruit leather. And these are useful in recipes that might use tomato paste or reconstituted by adding water to make, you know, tomato sauces. So for this, you would just cover or just core and cut the tomatoes into quarters. You could cook them covered over low heat for 15 to 20 minutes. And then you're just going to puree them and put them through a sieve and cook over low heat until they're kind of thickened. And then you spread it onto a tray that might be lined with plastic wrap, or if you have a actual fruit leather type tray, such as the one that's pictured here. And then you dry them at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So dry your tomatoes until they are, you know, slightly pliable. You should touch your fingers to them. If they feel sticky at all, then they're going to need more time to dry. You may need to, again, kind of turn those tomatoes, you know, rotate the racks and that sort of a thing. So keep an eye on them. You do want to store your dry tomatoes in airtight containers, such as canning jars with those tight-fitting lids. And you can also store them in freezer bags. Just note that these may not necessarily be insect or rodent proof, but store in a cool, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, dark place. You can also refrigerate or freeze them, and that will extend their storage time. For the best quality, you want to use them within 6 to 9 months, and that's when they're stored at that 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So if they're stored maybe at a little higher temps, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, for instance, you know, their storage time is going to be shortened a little bit. But check those dried tomatoes frequently during storage. You know, dried tomatoes, they can reabsorb moisture very easily, and they can cause some undesirable color and flavor changes. So just check them every once in a while. So just some kind of common questions that we've had before and that maybe you are thinking of. So what about those heirloom tomatoes, and what about tomatillos? Can I can those? And the answer here is yes and yes. Your heirloom tomatoes, you know, whether they're green or yellow or whatever color they might be, or even those unripe green tomatoes that we talked about, they are going to be canned in the same way, the same method as those regular red tomatoes. So you would do the same things, in terms of peeling them like the recipe states, and you would go ahead and add that acid just like the recipe states. Now for tomatillos, you don't have to remove their skin. Now they are going to have that dry outer husk, and so you do need to remove that, but you don't actually have to remove those inner skins. You don't want to remove those seeds. You just keep them as is. And even though a tomatillo is more acidic than your red tomatoes, the USDA still does call for the acidification following the same recommendations as your red tomatoes. So still, add your lemon juice or your citric acid to those tomatillos. And you can also pickle your green tomatoes as well too. I know we've seen some recipes in the USDA home canning guide for some pickled green tomatoes. You can even make green tomato relish. So there's other things that you can also do with those tomatoes. So can I use a pressure canner to can tomatoes? So as we said, we did say yes, you can definitely do that. And research has shown that, pressure canning can result in a nice, high quality and nutritious product. If the recipe gives you an option of canning in either a boiling water bath canner or a pressure canner, you can choose whatever method you want to use. But again, if the recipe only gives pressure canning as an option, then that is the method that you have to use, as there are too many low acid ingredients to really be able to process safely in a boiling water bath canner. It's important to note here though that whether you're processing in a boiling water bath canner or you're processing in a pressure canner, you still have to add acid. And the processing times and temperatures for water bath or pressure canning, it's all based upon an acidified tomato. So that's why even if you're using a pressure canner, you still have to add that acid to those tomatoes. So it's not an either or situation. Okay, so what about, can I sun dry tomatoes? And can I pack dried tomatoes in oil? So we're going to say no, it's not recommended for either. Even though that you can buy sun-dried tomatoes, it's not a viable option for many states, including here in Illinois, with our high summer humidity levels, because you really need a humidity level below 60%. And plus, and most importantly, as we said, these tomatoes are low in sugar and they're on the borderline of being low acid food. This just increases the risk for food spoilage. So vegetables and meats, they're not recommended for outdoor drying. And then it's best not to, pack those tomatoes in oil, particularly for long-term storage. Even though you can purchase tomato and oil mixtures, there is no USDA research tested recipe or process for acidifying tomato and oil mixtures at home for long-term storage. If the tomato is not dried properly and moisture remains, then it can create this kind of haven for Clostridium botulinum spores to germinate and to grow. So it's just a little risky there, where particularly if you're storing them for long term, more than a few days in the refrigerator, then it's just simply something that you just do not want to do and take that risk. So I want to spend kind of these last few minutes here to answer some of your questions. So certainly, please, welcome to, type those into the chat box. But while you're kind of doing that, I did want to encourage you here to visit the National Center for Home Food Preservation. It's a great resource for all things preservation. You're going to find not only canning, but you'll find information for dehydrating and for freezing and for more things than just your tomatoes. We've included our food preservation resource website there as well, and so that will have even more resources, along with a lot of the videos that that we have, including the one that you just saw with Mary Liz. Okay, so Lisa, I'm going to throw it over to you here. If you've got some questions ready, we're certainly happy to go ahead and start answering some of those.
Oh yeah, all right. So I'm trying to keep up with them here. So I'm going to go back to some of our first questions that were asked as you started. When we talk about cleaning, so can bleach solution be applied to granite countertops? Do you know?
Oh, yes, actually, it can safely be applied to those granite countertops. So no matter the countertop, as long as you are using a bleach solution, one such as what I already gave in terms of a homemade type solution, you don't want to add too much of that bleach. So stick to those amounts or use some type of bleach, wipe or something like that. As long as you're not adding too much bleach, I don't see any reason as to why that's going to hurt those granite countertops.
Great. All right. So I'm going to put two of these questions in together here. So one of the questions was they have a So Easy to Preserve, that book we talk about, in the 1999 edition. Should I get an updated copy? And also, where do we find approved sources of recipes, or what do we consider approved sources of recipes?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, the So Easy to Preserve book, you do want to, try to get the latest addition to that. And so, if you have the latest edition, that's great. If you don't have the latest edition, you can certainly go on to the National Center for Home Food Preservation's website and check to see they will have the latest version there. Usually there's there may not be too many differences there, but there could be some, and so it's always best to always update those, get the latest version wherever you can possible. And in terms of finding recipes that we know have been tested for safety, those would basically come from an extension resource. So if you're at a different extension, whether it's Illinois extension, whether it's Ohio, Penn State, Purdue, there's if you have recipes that are from those extension sites, then you're going to know that those are going to be research-based and ones that have been tested for safety. Of course, the recipes that we shared in terms of the National Center for Home Food Preservation, that website has a lot of different recipes, as does the So Easy to Preserve book. So either one of those or the USDA canning guide, those are all going to be tested recipes. But more than likely, if you are on the internet, you get to someone's maybe blog, even if it is, someone that on the Food Network, right? Like a celebrity, even if it's a popular magazine, we still recommend to not use those recipes, because we've seen many recipes that, come from those types of sites that are not safe. And so they could possibly pose that, that risk. So, yeah, those are the recipes that we would tell you to use, making sure they're an extension source, USDA source, or that National Home Food Preservation. That's what you want to go for.
Great. I'm going to ask you another question in relation to those that somebody asked is, can I use a recipe and canning directions from my canner, which is probably from 1980?
Yeah, so we recommend not to. Generally, a lot of those manufacturers, for one thing, we just are not real sure, where they're getting those recipes. You would hope that they would be testing those themselves and making sure that they're safe, but we just can't really, know that for sure. And particularly from those canning books that are that old, the manufacturers kind of recipes that, especially if they're from the 1980s or lower, or even, before that, I would say definitely don't use those. I would go for a more updated source.
Great. All right. So this is another one that was asked early on. Is putting tomatoes in heated ovens to remove skins recommended?
Oh, okay. You can do that. The one thing though that I would say with that is, you don't want to really cook that tomato. And so when you have it in an oven, sometimes it takes longer for those skins to really kind of peel and kind of come off. And so in an oven, you know, it can take a little longer. You might have kind of those temperatures where it's just going to maybe kind of cook for a little longer, and that's not necessarily what you want, because then your kind of tomatoes can become a little mushy and something that you just don't need. So, you know, I would still say, you know, the best method is still going to be, you know, taking those skins off by boiling water method. It's going to be your quickest way, 30 to 60 seconds. That's not too long. It's not heated very long, and so they won't become, you know, too mushy on you.
All right. So this is a question we've actually been asked a few times in our webinars, but I'm going to have Jenna answer it anyway. Is I understand people use Instant Pot for pressure canning with no temp out. Is that safe?
They use Instapot for pressure canning. Okay, no, we don't recommend that. We really only recommend pressure canning in a actual pressure canner, not in an Instapot and not in a pressure cooker. And I know that in a pressure cooker, including the Instapot, they will have directions on how to do that. They might even have recipes that they're giving on pressure canning. However, we don't recommend doing that. The USDA says that you need to do this in an actual pressure canner, just because those pressure cookers, they don't necessarily heat very evenly. And so you're processing the jars, or the food that's in those jars may not get that correct amount of kind of heat in the proper time and temperature it's needed to destroy any kind of microorganisms that are present. So we don't recommend using a pressure cooker or Instapot to do any kind of pressure cooking.
Great. Great. Thanks, Jenna. Okay, so this is a question. We had a lot of questions around the citric acid and talking about adding acidity to our tomatoes. So how much citric acid for a ½ pint jar? Would that be 1/8 of a teaspoon?
We still recommend, even if you're doing ½ pint jars, to do 1/4 of a teaspoon of that citric acid. So you're not going to have that. You're just going to keep that at that 1/4 of a teaspoon of citric acid. Yep, so great question.
Yeah, and that following along with that is, can I use ascorbic acid instead of citric acid?
No, ascorbic acid is not going to do the same thing. So it does need to be that citric acid, not ascorbic acid.
When we were watching that video, or we were talking about taking out the bubbles, is there a reason for not using non-plastic knives?
Okay, yeah, so you don't want to use metal knives, and I think that was the main thing. The metal knives, that those are going to be, it can kind of break your jars or kind of weaken those jars to where they might break later, especially as they're processed. So you don't want to use metal knives, but something like a plastic knife, or what's called that bubble freer, which is a plastic, that's going to be fine to use to get those air bubbles out. But you just don't want to use any type of like metal, just because that could break those jars.
All right, great. Okay, so we had a couple questions regarding pH. So can you take the pH of yourself to test for the safe acidity levels?
Yeah, you can't, unfortunately. We don't recommend that, just because a lot of those kind of home pH kits are not always going to be accurate like they're going to have in a commercial laboratory. So even if you've got, you know, some of those pH strips, we still recommend not using that, just because it may not always be accurate. Unfortunately, you know, you still can't do it.
We had a couple, is there a best way to core a tomato?
Best way to core a tomato. You know, I'm sure there's probably some crazy, great YouTube methods that are out there of, you know, it always amazes me when I check out some YouTube videos and seeing, you know, some new methods on how to, you know, do some things like that. And so there might be something out there. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of it. However, you know, I just simply take my paring knife and just simply cut deep around that core. And for me, it usually pops out pretty quickly, and it's not too hard to do. So, you know, that's the way I do it. But you might find some better methods that are out there as well.
Sure. All right. So I want to ask you a few questions regarding our salsa when we talked about it. All right. So what about using dry mixes for salsa? Can you do
Oh,
that?
sure. Yeah, so there are definitely some dry mixes that are available, and those are perfectly fine to use. I know, there's, of course, the different commercial type mixes that are specific for canning, and so that's what you would want to use. Follow the directions that they give you on those, and you'll be perfectly fine. So they're easy to use, and quite frankly, I think they're still quite tasty. So if you don't want to go to the process of having to chop up all of the tomato or the peppers and things like that. Maybe if you just want to add your tomatoes, add your acid, and that's about all you have to do. It's an easy process. So I'd say definitely go for it. But again, just follow those directions. They will have you add acid to them, so make sure that you do that.
All right. Okay. So for salsa, do you only add cilantro after opening your canned salsa?
Yeah, so it's not going to hurt. I mean, you can add salsa or add, excuse me, cilantro before you can your salsa, but it generally is not going to turn out to be maybe the best quality product. Sometimes you do kind of get some bitter notes when you add in fresh, herbs. So you're going to be better off. The flavor is going to be better. You're not going to get so much of that bitterness if you simply add that cilantro right before you serve.
All right. Well, this one, I know you covered this, but I think it's a good one to review again. Someone asked, can you decrease the amount of onions and peppers in a salsa recipe when canning?
So you can decrease, but you cannot increase. So that's the main thing. Decreasing, yes. Increasing, no.
Okay. For talking about kind of the freezing side of it, is it not good to use vacuum packing for freezing? Question mark.
Okay, you can use vacuum packaging. That would be fine to do that as long as you're doing it safely by way of, following kind of that instructions for vacuum packaging, where you're not going to have, any kind of hot kind of foods, left out of the refrigerator or freezer for longer than 2 hours. Otherwise, it should be safe to use those vacuum packages. The nice thing is it does kind of take out some of that air, so you're not going to get some of those freezer crystals, and it should preserve, that salsa or whatever kind of product you have for, quite some time, and it should be of good quality. So yeah, you can use the vacuum packaging for freezing. That would be fine to do that.
All right. And somebody asked, how long can I keep my tomatoes in the freezer?
Yeah, so for storage wise, generally anything that you're going to have in the freezer, it's going to be safe indefinitely. So, that's the good news, is that as long as you've kind of done everything correctly, it's going to be safe. But in terms of quality, try to use those up certainly within a year. That's going to be the best quality. So just make sure you label, you date everything, and try to use them up within a year.
Sure. All right. So here's another question about drying on that side of it. I prefer my dried foods to remain raw with enzymes intact, so under 104 degrees or so. Is there an option for this?
I'm not quite sure I understand. So to have them raw? Oh, you mean like not like blanching them in any way? Is that what you think?
I think that's what they're
Okay.
good.
Yeah, I mean, for tomatoes, you don't have to cook them, prior to either. You don't need to blanch or, anything like that. Even for tomatoes, you could even keep the peels on if you really wanted to. So, yeah, you could certainly dehydrate those by just simply keeping them raw. You would just, slice them up, or cut them to, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, and just go ahead and just dehydrate those directly on your dehydrator.
Yeah. All right. So we got a few more minutes left here. I do have a couple more I want to hit on. How do you tell if a tomato are overripe? Is there a way to tell?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you have tomatoes, they're going to be, you can tell if they're overripe just by the texture, for one thing. So, if they are really, quite soft, and really if they're going to be overripe, you might start seeing some just deterioration signs, whether they are kind of, starting to even lose some of their juices. They're, very soft and becoming, having a lot of these kind of soft spots. Sometimes the color will change, but not always, they might be a little deeper, darker red. So, those are just kind of some signs that that they're just becoming overripe. And so for that, of course, just make sure that you're not canning those. Those are not ones that you would want to use. You'd want to get rid of those and just not use those for canning.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenna. And because we are at 2 o'clock, we are going to end here today. We are keeping track of every single question that's been asked. So we will have Jenna go through and answer them all. And like we've done with the last 3 or 4 webinars, we'll make sure it's a nice handout with all of your answers in there as well. And I did include in the link here, or in your chat box, the link to get the recordings as well as additional resources. And if you want to sell at the farmer's market, we have a website on cottage food. And Jenna's one of our main contacts with that. So yeah, thank you for everybody. Just a reminder about our extending wellness program, wellness tips. You can go and sign up. Again, you don't receive more than 1 to 2 text messages a week. We don't share your information. And thank you for everyone for joining us. And yes, we will be making sure to kind of go through steam canner as well in that handout. I know there was a lot of questions on that as well. And we'll go into more detail in the handouts with that. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks so much.